Hello everyone, and welcome to Hill Street. Today's story is Something's Been Trying to Lure Me Away by Aggravating Pie 2048. If you end up enjoying this story, please leave a like. And if you enjoy hearing stories from me, please subscribe and become a resident of Hill Street and let me know how I'm doing in the comments. Now, let's get to this nightmare. There is one memory that plagues my childhood. It is so vivid, so clear, so chilling that it whines in the ear like tinnitus. Gone for most of the day, until the dead of night, when you have nothing but the silence of the night to accompany you. The memory drowns out all other recollections of lazy days, listening to Walkmans, staring out at rainy weather, or movies, or school. The memory was when I was very young. I remember that we had gone to the store for my school supplies for the first time after moving to Seattle. So I should have just turned 7. My mother had gotten distracted by some other sections to stock up our new residence, so she let me run off to gather my own school supplies. With a few spiral-bound notebooks and a pack of crayons in hand, I toddled back to where I had last seen my mother. The young me saw the figure of a woman in gray from behind, who then held out her hand, and I dipfully put my own little hand into it. She held on, and without saying a word, turned and began walking out of the store with me in tow. Perhaps I could have sensed something was wrong, as not a single word was uttered, nor a glance thrown at me, or the things that I now held. The figure that held my hand simply strode towards the exit in a confined manner. I started to lag, my little sneaker skipping off the tiled floor as I tried to pull my hand out of hers. But the hand turned into a vice grip, and the strides became more frantic. I tried to call out, but fear turned what should have been a scream into a whimper, or a mumble. The cashier that we had passed was the one who yelled out. Perhaps the sharp-eyed lady had noticed the unpaid items in my hand, or perhaps my body language was simply too unmistakable for mothers who had their own children. Its cover blown, the figure broke into a full sprint, charging forward and dragging me along. Behind me, the cashier had caught up, and with a mutual fury, shared by all people, latched onto me, pulled me back from the figure. For a moment, it felt like my shoulder would separate, but the second she stopped moving, the figure let go and took off outside in a sprint. Never once during all of this did the figure ever turn their head to look back at either of us. The police were called, and I remember my elbow had actually been dislocated at the radius, needing a doctor to pull it back into place. I still remember my mother coming back into the store with the detective, who had made an appointment with the owner to review the tapes. The detective hoped that the person who made such a seemingly targeted attempt might be recognized by my mother, and my mother, who had been holding me crying all night before, was now completely unwilling to leave me alone, if she could help it. When the video played, I was in the back being distracted by the detective's partner. That didn't stop me from taking a peek at the video. They paused on the only few frames that captured the figure's face. Eyes that were far too close together. A nose that seemed crudely stuck on, like Play-Doh. A mouth that was only half-heartedly etched in, like an afterthought. These were the traits that I could make out. The detective just sighed and blamed the old videotape for artifacting. I couldn't forget it. The second time it happened, I was at home alone for a school holiday that Mom didn't get off from her job at the hotel. I was upstairs mixing Legos and Bionicles when I heard the door rattle and click. In her tone and voice, although muffled by my closed door, I heard what sounded like, "Come down." In the condo where we lived, I could see the door from the stairs, and from that distance, I could see her face. Nothing seemed out of place to me, but at that point, I had a light case of nearsightedness that hadn't gotten bad enough to warrant a visit to the optometrist. I thought nothing of it as I started down the stairs to greet her. That's when the figure gestured, casually, like throwing her hand behind her shoulder, as if to say, "Come with me, outside." I got close enough to focus on her face, and that's when my fear instinct from before kicked in. Why wasn't she saying anything? The expression, the eyes open just a little too wide, the smile just a little too sardonic. Our minds are sensitive to micro expressions, and even without processing those details consciously, I froze on the step and felt my bowel drop. A tense moment filled the air as both of us stayed unmoving, while I tried desperately to figure out what to do. Suddenly, both of us exploded into motion as I decided on pushing off the stairs with maximal effort while the figure in front of me lunged forward, grabbing at my ankles. The hands brushed up against my heel, but some frantic kicks ensured that I wasn't grabbed. The back of my waist hit the stairs hard, but at this point, the adrenaline had dulled any semblance of pain. I scrambled back up to the stairs, grabbing the rail to turn towards my room, hearing stomps and feeling the wind of the figure that had recovered from her lunge and was chasing behind me. My door was open only a foot wide. With practical ease, I slipped past the opening and slammed it shut with my palm on the doorknob, simultaneously pushing the lock button closed. Angry, furious kicks and punches rained down on the door, that inch and a half of plywood separating me from what seemed like certain doom. I screamed. After a few seconds of trying, I saw 10 fingers curl up from underneath the crack of the door, making scratch marks on the white paint, and not even caring for the cracks and blood that resulted as it did so. Seeing that was futile, the fingers retracted and it went back to furious banging, straining the door. And then it stopped. The shadows from the bottom make it clear it had moved away. I looked at the window behind me, dreading the moment I would see the facsimile of my mother's face pop into the window, with those wide eyes and that rictus grin. It never came. The police came instead, knocking on the door and asking me to open it. I just cried on the other side of it. Evidently the family attached to the condo had hired a babysitter, and the cacophony generated by the pounding and screaming caused her to call for help. A locksmith was called, and the bedroom door was unlocked. The police had gotten my mother back from work, and the detectives were taking pictures of the damages to the door and the scratches on the bottom of it. Nobody told me anything. I grew frustrated, but wasn't in the mood to say anything. The only snippet I caught was a fragment of hushed discussion between my mother and the detective. The word sister. Did I have a twin aunt that I had not been told about? Was that who was going after me? Weeks later, I was still not told anything. I subconsciously grew more distant, almost flinching when my mother came into the room. It hurt her, I know, but she wouldn't answer any of my questions. I was frustrated. I know the door was unlocked with a key. The sound I heard, and the detective confirms as much. The fact that somehow a key had ended up with who I assume was her insane sister, and I wasn't being informed, really betrayed me. What happened merely weeks later changed my mind about the situation. Winter break with friends in the neighborhood that went to the same high school helped me keep my mind off of things. We played like we were younger, agreeing to stay out of our houses and away from video games, to be outside building snow forts, having snowball fights and exploring. Like any other day, we decided to play hide and seek. I felt safe with such a big group. The seeker counted down and we started running. Lei, one of the girls in the area, had suddenly popped up behind me. I suppose she had been late and walked on towards the end of the rules session. I had gotten along well with her before, so I followed her as we ran in the streets covered by winter, while the white fog of our breath billowed out before us. We started getting farther, and a sense of unease started to creep into me as the sounds around me dropped away. Lei seemed like she knew exactly where she wanted to go as she pointed to an alley behind the fence of a house in the neighborhood. "Here," she chirped out. It sounded like a bird's voice. This made me freeze. Try as I might to bury it in my heart, my recent experience was still in my mind. My feet refused to move as I watched her figure disappear just behind the wooden fence, right out of sight. "Come!" I refused to move, instead circling to the other side of the fence. My heart was pounding up to my throat. My ears felt stuffy, and I don't think I would have been able to hear any sounds had they happened. Part of me knew the game was up, and that no matter what, I would be running. But another part of me held instead anger. I wanted to see, and the gaps in the wooden stakes offered me that opportunity. As we stayed in deadlock, two hands wrapped in purple mittens jumped up and grabbed the top of the wooden fence. It shocked me into motion, and I began sprinting back the way I came, faster than I had ever run in my life. I tried to listen hard for the sounds of footsteps in the snow behind me, but there was nothing. My mind imagined the possibility of a hand grabbing my hood and yanking me back by the neck at any point, but it never came. I didn't even turn back to look. Soon, I found another pair that had been trying to hide behind the bushes. They were obviously alarmed by the fact that I had been sprinting towards where we had just left. I was relieved to see somebody else. I thought carefully about what I wanted to say. "You guys saw Leah earlier with us, yeah? She was wearing a teal winter coat," I asked. "Yeah? She ran off with you, right?" they answered. "Right. I completely lost track of her, and we were supposed to stay together. I couldn't reach her by phone, and I'm kinda worried she's missing. Can we stop for a moment and give her a call?" A blatant lie, but I wasn't about to start with my history of being abducted. They called her. I held my breath since I hadn't actually tried. No answer. We quickly canceled the game and got our group back together. I felt more safe now with friends milling about. I was asked some questions about where I last saw Lee. I gave some vague answers, not hoping to go back to the house where I had that last encounter. Eventually, we decided to go knock on her door, thinking that she might have gone home for some reason. Or if not, we could at least inform her parents. When we arrived and knocked, there was no answer. "Are you kids looking for Leah?" Leah's elderly neighbor poked her head out of her door to ask. "Yes, ma'am," we answered. "She and her family left early this morning to go on a ski trip. They won't be back until next week. Come see her when she's back." Such a sweet old lady. But the news she gave us happily made our hearts chill. All of us. Because almost all of us saw Lee with the group. They knew something was wrong. I was no longer invited. Not that I had any objections. I was busy hiding out at home, panicking now that I realized anyone could come after me. For the rest of high school, I tried to interrogate my mother on the question of our family. Who were my grandparents? Who was my father? Did I have any other relatives? Every question was met with what I interpreted as excuses and dodges. She was an orphan, and I didn't have any grandparents. I was an IVF baby, and she couldn't contact my biological father. I grew more paranoid and alone, but at least nothing else happened for the rest of high school. A year after I left for college was when my mother fell ill. When I visited the hospital, I was told quarantine was in full effect. Nobody was allowed contact, no matter how dire the situation was. The physician managing my mother's care came to speak to me. Could we step into this room for a second? He pointed to the serenity room behind him, obviously having been prepared beforehand. Unfortunately, all I saw of it was the sinister darkness of the room, and not its inviting privacy. "I'd like to stay here, please," I answered. "Are you sure? I'd really rather have this talk in private." My response was unexpected. "I don't follow anyone anywhere alone," I responded. "I understand. Well, I have to give difficult news. We are not optimistic about her care. We'll try our very best, but you should start preparing and look into these options I have in this pamphlet here." I started roughly tuning out the rest he had to say. I could only look through the port of the glass at my mother, that was on a breathing machine, unconscious, pale, and thin. After all these years, I feel like somewhere deep down inside, I loved her and appreciated that she tried her best. But some part of me never forgave her for the secrets. I went back to the house and began to sort through our legal documents to get what the pamphlet said I had to prepare. Then, in the back, I found my birth certificate, my full name, my social security number, place of birth, healthy male, 6.5 pounds, and twin. Twin? I was a twin. What happened to my sibling then? I made a call to all the IVF clinics servicing the city listed on the certificate, as well as the hospital. No dice. Even with the limited information they were allowed to give me, I could tell by their voices that they had no clue about my mother and no records of me. The hospital, most of the people working there had changed, but there were still a few obstetricians that might have been there at the time, although they weren't in at the moment and they had to call back. I was getting desperate. I got back to the hospital and got hold of the physician I spoke to earlier. "I need to see my mother," I pleaded with him. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But please." I pulled out my birth certificate. "This says I have a sibling out there somewhere. Mom never mentioned that. I want to know what happened to them. This might be my only remaining relative in the world, and she's the only person who knows. Please let me ask her this." "I'm so sorry, but she had just passed away less than an hour ago. We had been trying to call you in to view her body one last time and gather her effects." I was crushed. I got home and looked through the last few things my mother had on her person before she left this earth. Among them was the locket she had always worn, a simple brass thing that I had played around with sometime as a child when she let me. I could never get it open, and she told me that it didn't, and I never questioned it. When I held it in my hands close to my face, it seemed to pop open the moment my breath hit the lock. Inside was a 4-leaf clover that had long withered and desiccated. The obstetrician called back. After a brief conversation, he informed me that he wasn't responsible for delivering me, but at the time, an unknown male, whom others had assumed was my mother's husband, had been in the room for the birth, and had simply walked away with one of the children. The hospital had gotten severely reprimanded, but after an investigation turned up nothing, the case went unsolved. And that's it. My questions had hit a dead end. There's nothing else for me to ask, nothing else for me to pursue. My mother had taken any answers for me and left for good. All I have is the remains of a 4-leaf clover and no answers to any questions. The neighborhood had gotten awfully quiet. The house is even more so now that I'm the only one inside it. Every figure that passes by outside makes me jump, but I swear I can see 2 silhouettes at night, standing motionless. I convince myself that they are bushes or trash cans, but those spots are always empty in the morning. Soon they are coming, and there's nothing much I can do about it, except wait.